The man had lived in that quiet neighborhood for almost 2 years, and in that time he had learned to keep to himself. His property sat a little apart from the other houses, with a long gravel driveway and a big red barn sitting behind the main house. To most people, it looked like an ordinary barn, something you would expect to find in a rural community. But to him, it was more than just a place to store old tools or hay. Sometimes it was used for his work that almost nobody in the neighborhood knew about. He wasn't a farmer, and he wasn't just a regular homeowner. He was a DEA agent, someone who had spent years chasing down drug traffickers and working undercover in dangerous situations. The barn, for him, was sometimes used as a safe storage spot for equipment or for meetings when privacy mattered. The neighborhood itself was a strange mix of country freedom and strict rules. It was governed by a homeowners association, or HOA. And that meant people were expected to follow a set of rules about their lawns, fences, house colors, and sometimes even how many cars they could park in their driveways. He didn't care much about the HOA as long as they left him alone, paid his dues, kept his lawn trimmed, and minded his business. But there was one woman who never seemed satisfied with minding her own life. Her name was Linda, but everyone called her Karen. She had that reputation, nosy, bossy, and always convinced she had authority over others. Karen lived 2 houses down. From the very first week he had moved in, she had introduced herself in a way that felt less like a greeting and more like a warning. She had shown up with a clipboard, asking about what kind of work he did, why he needed such a big barn, and whether he had read all the HOA rules carefully. He had smiled politely, answered nothing directly, and closed the conversation as quickly as he could. Since then, she had made herself his unwanted shadow. She liked to walk her small white dog right up along his fence line, peeking into his yard. Sometimes, he caught her taking photos of his driveway. And once, she even stood on the edge of his property, staring at the barn like she was trying to figure out what was inside. For him, it was both annoying and amusing. He had dealt with dangerous criminals in dark alleys and hostile gang members during raids. Compared to that, a nosy neighbor wasn't exactly threatening. But still, he knew nosy people could cause problems if they didn't know when to stop. One warm afternoon, he was in the yard near the barn, fixing one of the padlocks and making sure the doors were secure. He heard the familiar clicking of Karen's dog nails on the sidewalk and felt that small wave of irritation rise inside him. Sure enough, Karen turned and walked straight toward him, her sunglasses perched on her nose like a badge of authority. "Hello," she said in that sharp tone. She often used, "I need to talk to you about your barn." Straightened up, brushing dust off his hands, and gave her a patient look. "My barn?" he asked, though he already knew what was coming. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'm on the HOA board, and there have been some questions about what exactly you're keeping in there. Barns aren't usually part of approved HOA structures unless they meet certain standards, and I need to inspect it." He almost laughed. The way she said "inspect it" made it sound like she was a government official with real power. But she wasn't. She was just a neighbor with too much free time. "You don't need to inspect it," he said calmly. "It's private property." Karen frowned, pulling her dog's leash tighter. "You may not realize, but HOA rules allow board members to check for violations. If you're storing vehicles or equipment that are not permitted, it could be a problem." "We've had complaints." "Complaints?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "From who?" She lifted her chin. "From concerned neighbors. People want to know what's going on here. That barn is locked up all the time, and nobody ever sees inside. What are you hiding?" He took a slow breath, reminding himself to stay calm. This wasn't a street corner with a drug dealer who might pull a gun. This was just a woman with too much curiosity. "I'm not hiding anything," he said. "And with all due respect, you don't have the right to demand access." Karen's eyes narrowed. "So you're refusing to let me in?" "Yes," he said plainly. For a moment, she just stood there, her face stiff with frustration. She wasn't used to people shutting her down so directly. Usually her neighbors either gave in to her demands or argued with her until she got her way. This man, however, wasn't budging. She tried again, lowering her voice as if she could coax him. "Look, if everything is fine, Then why not just show me? That way I can reassure the board. It will only take a minute. He shook his head. That's not going to happen. The conversation was over for him, but not for her. Karen pulled her dog closer and gave him one last glare. You know, refusing cooperation only makes things look suspicious. I'll be bringing this up with the HOA board. And if necessary, I'll call the proper authorities. We'll see how you like that. He didn't even respond. He just turned back to the barn and checked the lock again, making it clear she wasn't going to push her way inside. Karen muttered something under her breath and marched back toward the street. Her dog trotting at her heels. As she disappeared, he couldn't help but shake his head. He had dealt with drug lords who thought they were untouchable, cartel members who threatened entire communities, and traffickers who believed they could outsmart federal agents. Yet here he was, in his own quiet neighborhood, facing off against a woman who thought her HOA title gave her authority over his barn. Still, he knew this wasn't the end. People like Karen never let things drop so easily. He had seen the way. She looked at the barn, the suspicion in her eyes. She was convinced he was hiding something. And when people like her got an idea stuck in their heads, they didn't stop until they got the drama they were looking for. What she didn't know was that this wasn't the kind of game she wanted to play. The days after Karen's first attempt to enter the barn were quiet, but not in a comfortable way. The man could feel that something was brewing. He'd lived long enough and worked in his line of duty long enough to recognize when trouble was circling. Karen hadn't just walked away that day with her dog. She had walked away with a plan. At first it was little things. He noticed her standing on the sidewalk with her phone in her hand, pointing it toward his yard as though she were taking casual pictures of the trees or sky. But her lens was always angled at the barn. One morning, when he went out to get the mail, he caught her whispering to another neighbor while pointing at his property. The other neighbor looked uncomfortable, nodding but not really engaging. The man knew exactly what she was doing. She was spinning stories, feeding rumors. Before long, the whispers became obvious. A neighbor who usually waved at him while mowing his lawn stopped waving. Another neighbor, who sometimes brought over cookies at Christmas, avoided eye contact altogether. It was subtle but noticeable. The man didn't need to guess what was being said. Karen had planted the idea that he was hiding something shady. In his barn, and to ordinary people who didn't know him well, it was easy to believe. After all, the barn was always locked, and nobody was ever invited inside. Karen didn't stop there. She began walking her dog more often, deliberately slowing her steps whenever she reached his property line. Sometimes she even paused, cupping her hand above her eyes like she was peeking in. She had no shame. She wanted him to see her. It was like a little power game, her silent way of saying, "I'm watching you." One evening, just as the sun was going down, he was checking his truck near the barn when Karen marched straight up the driveway. She didn't bother with greetings. "I've been very patient with you," she announced, her voice clipped. "But this barn is a problem. As an HOA board member, I have the right to know what's inside." Leaned against his truck, folding his arms. "You don't have that right," he said calmly. Her cheeks flushed red. "We've had multiple complaints now. People are concerned you're storing vehicles, maybe even dangerous equipment. If you have nothing to hide, then let me in. Prove it." He shook his head. "That's not how this works. It's private property. The HOA doesn't control what's inside my barn." Karen stepped closer, her dog yanking at the leash. "You refuse. You're only making it worse. I can escalate this. I will escalate this. You may think you can ignore the rules, but not in this neighborhood. Not with me on the board." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. He kept his face calm, but inside he felt a twinge of irritation. She was relentless, and her obsession with the barn was growing more extreme by the day. Still, he knew better than to lose his cool. If there was one thing his job had taught him, it was that patience often disarmed an opponent faster than anger. "I'm telling you one last time," he said firmly. "You don't have the authority to enter my barn. End of discussion." Karen stared at him, her lips tight. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she jerked her dog's leash and spun on her heel. "Ein," she snapped. "If you want to play it this way, I'll just call the police. Let's see what they think about your little secret." He watched her march down the driveway, shaking his head. It was almost surreal. He had dealt with cartel bosses who ran international drug operations. Men who would rather shoot their way out of a problem than talk. And here he was, at home, facing a woman with a clipboard and an overblown sense of authority. Yet the danger was still real. A false call could create chaos. The next few days proved his suspicion right. Karen started approaching neighbors more. Openly, he overheard her one afternoon while she was talking to an older couple who lived across the street. "All I'm saying," she said loudly, making sure her voice carried, "is that nobody knows what he's doing in there. People don't keep barns locked up like Fort Knox unless they're hiding something. For all we know, he could be running some kind of operation." The couple looked uncomfortable, nodding politely, but not adding to her accusations. The man inside his house heard every word. Later, another neighbor mentioned it casually to him. "Hey, you might want to know. Karen's been saying you're storing drugs or something. I don't believe her, but, well, you know how she is. Just thought you should be aware." He thanked the neighbor and shrugged it off, but inwardly, he was alert. Karen wasn't just being nosy anymore. She was actively trying to smear his name. That made her more dangerous. Rumors had a way of snowballing. At night, he sometimes saw the glow of her phone camera from the street. She was taking pictures, maybe even videos. He wondered what she thought she was capturing, maybe shadows or locked doors she would later use as evidence. Finally, another confrontation came. It was a Saturday morning, and he was working near the barn again when Karen strode up, her phone in her hand this time, recording. "I'm documenting this," she said. "We're refusing to comply with HOA rules, and I'm gathering proof." "Proof of what?" he asked, his patience wearing thin. "Proof of your violations?" she said confidently. "Proof that you're hiding illegal equipment, or maybe even something worse. People are talking, and I intend to protect this neighborhood." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Karen listened carefully. "You're crossing a line."
"Die!"
"Is harassment. You have no authority here, and no right to be on my property without my permission. Turn around and leave. Now." For a second, he thought she might actually back down, but instead, she raised her phone higher. "This is being recorded. You touch me or threaten me, it'll all be on video. I'm giving you one last chance. Open the barn, or I'll make the call." His jaw tightened. He didn't raise his voice, didn't move closer. He simply looked at her steadily until she felt the weight of his silence. Finally, she turned away, muttering, "You'll regret this. I'll handle it." As she marched back down the driveway, he knew what was coming. She wasn't bluffing anymore. She was going to call the police. And when she did, things were going to get messy. The barn, the locked doors, the secrecy, it was too tempting for someone like her. She couldn't imagine that the truth was far bigger than her HOA board or her petty authority. She couldn't imagine that the man she was targeting wasn't just a neighbor with a locked barn, but a federal agent whose work carried far more weight than her gossip. And soon she was going to find out. It was only a matter of time before Karen finally made her move. She had threatened it often enough, and he knew her type. People like her didn't bluff. They lived for drama. And calling the police on a neighbor was exactly the kind of performance she craved. It happened on a warm Sunday afternoon. He was sitting in his kitchen with a cup of coffee when he heard voices outside, louder than usual. He stood up and glanced through the window, and sure enough, there was Karen at the edge of his driveway, phone pressed against her ear, pacing back and forth. Her little white dog tugged at the leash impatiently while she raised her voice for everyone nearby to hear. Double quotes, "Yes." "Yes, officer," she said loudly. "There's a man here who refuses to comply with community rules. He's locking people out of a barn that could be dangerous. I think he might be storing illegal substances. Yes, it looks very suspicious. He's been aggressive with me, too." The man sighed, setting his coffee cup down. She was really doing it. Within minutes, the sound of sirens drifted down the quiet street. Neighbors started stepping out of their houses, pretending to water plants or take out trash, all of them curious about what was about to happen. By the time the first police car rolled up, Karen was practically bouncing on her feet with self-importance. Another squad car followed, lights flashing, tires crunching against the pavement. The officers stepped out carefully, hands on their belts, scanning the area. Karen waved frantically. Over here, it's him right there, she shouted, pointing toward the man's house. He stepped outside calmly, closing his door behind him. Didn't rush, didn't look panicked. He had dealt with law enforcement before, and he knew the best way to handle situations like this was with patience and professionalism. The first officer approached. "Sir, we got a call about a disturbance. Are you the homeowner?" "Yes," he said evenly. Karen jumped in before he could say more. "That's him. He's been hiding things in that barn. I told him I'm on the HOA board and I have the right to inspect it, but he blocked me. He's refusing to cooperate. I'm sure he's hiding drugs or dangerous equipment in there. The neighbors are all concerned." The man looked at the officer, then at Karen, and simply said, "That's not true." Officer held up a hand. "Ma'am, let me handle this." Then he turned back to the man. "Do you mind explaining what's going on?" He nodded. "It's simple. She tried to come onto my property and demanded to enter my barn. I told her she has no right to do that. She refused to take no for an answer. Now she's making up stories." Karen gasped, offended. "Making up stories? Are you kidding me? He's hiding something in there? Look at it, locked up all the time, like a fortress. Who does that if they don't have something illegal?" The officer glanced toward the barn. It was a sturdy structure, the doors secured with a heavy padlock. To a curious eye, it might indeed look mysterious. But to the man, it was simply secure exactly how it needed to be. "Sir," the officer said carefully, "do you mind telling us what's in the barn?" He smiled faintly. "Private property. Nothing that concerns the HOA or my neighbor." Karen threw her hands up. "See? He won't answer. He's hiding something. You should break that lock and check. I'm telling you, I've lived here long enough to know when something isn't right. And this isn't right." The second officer, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. "Ma'am, we can't just break into a building on private property without probable cause. It's not how the law works." Karen spun toward him, her voice shrill. "But I'm giving you probable cause. I'm a board member of this community. I've received complaints. Isn't that enough?" The officers exchanged a look. Clearly, they were already doubting her credibility, but Karen wasn't about to back down. She stepped closer to them, pointing at the barn again. "If you don't go in there, you're ignoring a serious threat. He could be storing chemicals, weapons, drugs you don't know. And when something happens, it'll be on you." The man stood silently, watching her dig her own hole. He could have spoken up, could have shut the whole thing down right then, but he wanted to see how far she would go. He had faced worse than this. Finally, one of the officers turned to him again. "Sir, would you be willing to open the barn voluntarily? It would clear this up quickly." Karen's eyes lit up. She thought she had one. "Yes, open it. Let's all see what's inside." The man shook his head. "No, I don't open my barn to anyone without legal authority, and she has none." Street had grown quieter now. The neighbors were standing in their yards, watching closely. Some held their phones, recording. Karen noticed and straightened her shoulders, as if she were the star of some neighborhood reality show. "Officers, you see how suspicious he's being?" she said, raising her voice so everyone could hear. "What innocent man refuses to show? What's inside? He's dangerous. He threatened me before, too. Need to do something." The first officer sighed. "Ma'am, making false reports to 911 is a serious matter. If you don't have real evidence, we can't just assume wrongdoing." Karen's mouth dropped open. "False. Are you saying I'm lying?" "We're saying," the officer replied firmly, "that locking a barn isn't illegal, and harassing your neighbor could be." Karen turned red, flustered. "This is unbelievable. You're just going to let him get away with this? Out. You see how shady this is?"
Ow.
The man finally spoke again, his voice calm but steady.
Ow.
"Officers, I appreciate your professionalism. I think it's time I clarify who I am." He reached into his pocket and slowly pulled out a leather badge wallet. He flipped it open, revealing his D credentials. For a moment, the air went still. The officers blinked, reading carefully. Then both straightened their entire demeanor. "Shifting, sir," one said respectfully. "We had no idea." "Understood completely." Karen's jaw nearly hit the ground. She stared at the badge, then at him, then back at the officers. "D," she repeated, her voice cracking. What? No, that can't be right. He's lying. The officer shook his head. It's real, and it explains everything. Man tucked the badge away again. I don't discuss my work with neighbors. I certainly don't open federal property for anyone who demands it. The second officer turned to Karen, his patience gone. You wasted police resources? With your call. You made accusations with no evidence. Do you realize that's a criminal offense? Karen stammered, suddenly pale. I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. I thought he was dangerous. The first officer crossed his arms. The only dangerous thing here is making false accusations against a federal agent. Oh. Do you understand how serious that could have been? For once, Karen had no words. She stood frozen, her dog tugging impatiently at the leash, while the neighbors around the street whispered. Among themselves, some shook their heads, others laughed quietly, and a few even pulled out their phones to text friends about what they had just witnessed. The man stayed calm, but inside he felt the satisfaction of the moment. Karen had pushed and pushed, and now she was face to face with the truth she had never expected. This was no longer her game. The moment the badge came out, the whole atmosphere shifted. Just seconds before, Karen had been standing tall, waving her arms, acting like she was the hero of the street. But once the gold badge with the 3 letters deflashed in front of everyone, her voice seemed to vanish. The officers, who had been carefully neutral, suddenly stiffened with respect, and the neighbors who had been peeking from their lawns leaned in closer, whispering to each other. Trying to process what they were seeing, Karen blinked at the badge like it was some kind of trick. No, this isn't real, she sputtered. Her face was flushed, and she pointed her finger at him again, desperate to keep her ground. He's lying. He made that up. Nobody like him would live here. He's just pretending. One of the officers cut her off, his tone sharp. Ma'am, that's a real badge. And if you don't calm down, you're going to make this situation much worse for yourself. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She looked around at the neighbors, hoping for support, but none of them came to her rescue. Some were holding back laughter, others looked embarrassed for her, and a few were recording everything with their phones. For the first time, Karen didn't look confident. She looked trapped. The man slid the badge back into his pocket, his expression calm. I wasn't planning on sharing that information, he said evenly. I don't bring my work home. But since my neighbor here decided to call 911 and accuse me of criminal activity, I thought it was time to clarify who I am. Karen shook, her head still not accepting it. This doesn't make sense. Why would a DEA agent live here? Why would he keep secrets in that barn? That's not fair to the neighborhood. The second officer finally stepped forward, his voice firm. Ma'am, you need to stop. Right now. You've made serious accusations, wasted emergency resources, and disrupted the peace. That's not protecting the neighborhood. That's harassment. Her lips trembled as if she wanted to argue, but no words came out. The little white dog barked once, pulling on the leash, as if even it was tired of the drama. The officers turned back to the man. Sir, we apologize for the inconvenience, one said. It seems your neighbor has taken things far beyond reason. Do you want to press charges for harassment or for the false report? Karen gasped. Charges? You can't be serious. I was just doing my duty. I thought something illegal was happening. You can't punish me for being careful. The man didn't answer right away. He studied her, watched her squirm. A part of him was tempted to say yes, to press charges, to finally teach her that actions have consequences. But another part of him, the part that had dealt with far worse people than Karen, knew she had already humiliated herself enough. Sometimes public embarrassment cut deeper than any legal punishment. I'll think about it, he said calmly. For now, I just want this to end. The officer nodded. Understood. Ma'am, you're officially warned if you continue harassing your neighbor or make another false call, you will face legal consequences. Do you understand? Karen's voice was barely above a whisper. Yes. Say it clearly, the officer demanded. Her face burned red as she repeated, Yes, I understand. The officers gave the man a respectful nod before turning back to their vehicles. The flashing lights shut off, and the tension in the air seemed to ease. One by one, the neighbors who had been watching began retreating to their homes, still buzzing with chatter, still glancing back at Karen with judgment in their eyes. The man stood silently on his driveway, hands in his pockets. Watching Karen, she lingered, frozen, like she couldn't decide whether to leave quickly or try one last time to save face. Finally, she tugged on her dog's leash and stormed away, muttering angrily to herself. As she disappeared down the street, he let out a slow breath. It was over for now. But he knew Karen wouldn't let it go completely. People like her didn't know how to admit they were wrong, just regrouped and tried again in a different way. The difference now was that her power had been broken. She no longer looked like the queen of the neighborhood. She looked like a fool who had been exposed in front of everyone. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, the man sat outside on his porch with another cup of coffee. A couple of neighbors walked by and gave him small waves, friendlier than they had been in weeks. One even said, "Hey, sorry about all that. Some of us never believed her anyway." He just nodded politely. He wasn't interested in becoming the center of gossip or earning anyone's sympathy. All he wanted was peace and quiet. But he also knew the barn had drawn too much attention now. People who hadn't cared before were suddenly curious. He would have to be even more careful about what he kept there and how often he used it. Karen, meanwhile, sat in her own house, stewing. She replayed the scene over and over in her head, the way the badge had silenced her, the way the officers had scolded her, the way her neighbors had stared. Humiliation clung to her like a heavy coat. She had called 911 expecting to be a hero, the woman who uncovered a hidden threat. Instead, she had been exposed as the liar, the troublemaker. And worse, she had tried to challenge someone with more authority than she could ever dream of. She couldn't stop thinking about his calm face, the way he had handled everything without raising his voice. That, more than anything, made her furious. She had screamed, accused, and demanded, and he had simply stood there, patient and unshaken, until she crumbled. She hated that. She hated him for making her look powerless. But she also felt a new kind of fear. For the first time, she realized she had no control over him. He wasn't just some ordinary neighbor she could bully with HOA rules. He was part of something bigger, something she couldn't touch. And that scared her more than she wanted to admit. As the night settled in, the neighborhood returned to its usual quiet. But beneath that calm, a new balance had been set, the man had revealed. Just enough to stop Karen in her tracks, and the whole community had witnessed it. She would never be able to whisper her suspicions again without people remembering what happened. And though he preferred to keep his life private, a small part of him felt a sense of satisfaction. Karen had tried to paint him as a threat, but in the end, she had only exposed herself. It wasn't the kind of victory he sought, but it was enough. The neighborhood was never quite the same after that Sunday. The flashing police lights, the shouting, the reveal of the badge, people talked about it for weeks. At first, the whispers traveled from yard to yard like wildfire. Neighbors who barely said hello to each other before were suddenly having long conversations over fences, retelling the story in their own way. But one detail never changed. Karen had called the police on the wrong man, and she had been humiliated in front of everyone. The man went on with his life as if nothing had happened. It was his way. He had spent years dealing with dangerous operations where one wrong move could cost lives. Compared to that, neighborhood drama seemed like background noise. Every morning, he got up, had his coffee, checked the barn, and went about his day. He didn't mention the incident to anyone, didn't brag about it, didn't even explain himself further. The less people knew, the better. That was how he liked it. But the neighbors saw him differently now. People who once avoided eye contact began greeting him again, their voices friendlier, their smiles warmer. Some even stopped to chat, pretending it was casual, but always trying to sneak in a question. "So, you really work for the government?" one asked in a hushed voice. "Must be exciting, huh?" He only smiled politely and gave vague answers. "It's a job," he said. That was all they would get from him. He didn't know them anything more. Karen, on the other hand, couldn't escape what had happened. Every time she walked her little white dog, she felt the eyes on her. Some neighbors whispered as she passed. Others simply turned away, no longer eager to talk to her. She had always been the loudest voice in the community, the self-proclaimed guardian of the neighborhood. But now her authority was shattered. Nobody wanted to listen to her warnings anymore. One afternoon, during an HOA meeting in the community clubhouse, she tried to bring up the barn again. "Still don't know what's inside," she said loudly, her eyes darting around the room. "We don't even know if it follows code." But before she could finish, another board member interrupted. "Karen, drop it. We all know what happened. We're not going through this again." The room grew quiet. Karen's face turned red as the other members nodded in agreement. For once, nobody backed her up. She tried to protest, her voice trembling with frustration. "But I was only trying to keep the neighborhood safe." "No, someone else. Cut in. You embarrassed all of us. You wasted police time. It's over." That was the end of her little reign. She left the meeting in a huff, dragging her dog along, but the damage was done. Why, she had lost her credibility, and nothing she said from then on mattered. The man noticed the change too. When he saw Karen walking her dog now, she didn't march with her usual pride. She kept her eyes down, moving quickly, no longer daring to stop near his fence. If she saw him outside, she crossed to the other side of the street. It was almost comical. The woman who once threatened to inspect his barn now couldn't even look him in the eye. One evening, as he sat on his porch, one of the older neighbors strolled over with a smile. "You know," the neighbor said, "you handled that whole thing better than anyone else could have. Calm as can be, while she made a fool of herself. People around here respect that." He only nodded, sipping his coffee. Respect wasn't what he wanted. He just wanted peace. Still, he understood what the man meant. Sometimes the best way to win was to stay calm and let the other person destroy themselves. Karen's downfall had another effect on the community, too. People who once let her boss them around now pushed back. She tried to scold a neighbor for leaving trash cans out too long. They laughed and ignored her. When she complained about a car parked slightly crooked, nobody cared. Her voice had lost all weight. She had become the neighborhood joke. For the man, life slowly returned to normal. The barn remained locked, and he continued using it as he always had. If anything, he was more careful now, making sure no one ever saw too much. He didn't want curiosity stirred up again. But the truth was, Karen had given him an unexpected advantage. Her failed stunt had put an end to any future questions. Nobody dared to pry anymore. The barn was no longer a mystery people wanted to solve. It was something they preferred to leave alone. Sometimes, late at night, he thought about how close it had come to being a bigger problem if the officers hadn't handled it professionally. If Karen had pushed harder, if things had gone differently, it could have been messy. A false report was no small matter, especially when federal work was involved. But it had resolved itself in a way that worked out better than he could have planned. Karen, meanwhile, grew quieter. She still lived in the neighborhood, but her presence was smaller, like someone who had been defeated. She still walked her dog, still peeked out her windows, but she no longer tried to boss people around. Her humiliation had taught her something, even if she never admitted it out loud. The man never gloated, never rubbed it in. He didn't need to. Karen's silence was victory enough. Months later, when the seasons changed and the leaves began to fall, the incident was just another story neighbors told to new families moving in. "Oh, you should have seen it," they'd say with a chuckle. Kieran called the cops on him because of his barn. Thought he was hiding drugs or something. Turns out he's D. She nearly fainted right there in the street. Would laugh, shake their heads, and quickly learn to ignore Karen's dramatic warnings. Her power had vanished completely. As for the man, he continued to live the quiet life he had always wanted. His job still pulled him away sometimes into dangerous places and difficult missions, but when he came home, he had peace. No more nosy inspections, no more gossip that carried weight, just quiet evenings on the porch, coffee in hand, and the knowledge that Karen had learned the hard way not to mess with him, and in the end, that was all he had ever wanted, to be left alone.